Assalamu alaikum. Welcome. You are listening to Footprints of the Creator. Your host this evening is myself, Yusuf.
And Abdul Kader. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome. This evening we're going to continue with the honey aspect, which we touched on last week. We will go on further discussing the bees, the marvelous process which is involved in the formation of honey, and one or two interesting phenomena with regard to the organization of the bees in the hive. Last week, as we've discussed, we've gone into detail with regard to the various functions of the various bees and how each has got the respective function. We are now going to look at the manner in which the worker bees go about in the production of the honey itself, to show how systematic and how organized they are and how meticulous this entire process is. The worker bee, which we mentioned last week, is female, collects the honey in its honey sac. Now, in order for it to fill its honey sac, the worker bee, one single bee, has got to visit approximately 1,000 to 1,500 individual flowers to make one fill up of its honey sac. Now, as much as 60 full loads of nectar, which it collects in its honey sac, are required to produce only a thimbleful of honey. So we can see the tremendous amount of work that is involved in the production of such small quantities. When you get a favorable season where there are plenty flowers and plenty nectar available, one hive alone can produce as much as 2 pounds of honey a day. Now this actually translates into approximately 5 million bee journeys. That is 5 million flights from the bee, traveling from the hive to the flower, back to the hive, back to the flower. That's 5 million journeys are required in order to produce 2 pounds of honey a day. Now, how does the honey form? What is the process involved in the production of the honey? Now, the marvelous thing with regard to the stomach of the bee is this: what needs to be kept in mind is that in the stomach of the bee there are actually two cavities or two openings. One is the honey sac, and the other is the actual stomach of the bee, where the bee eats the food. Now, the contents of the bee's stomach are actually not the bee's own. Instead, it actually belongs to the hive. So when the bee wants to feed itself, it opens up a valve which empties the nectar from the honey sac, which, as I mentioned, is in its stomach as well. And from the honey sac, some nectar pours into the rest of the stomach. When the bee returns to the hive, the honey that is in the honey sac is actually regurgitated. It actually like vomits, if I may use the word. It regurgitates the honey out, or the nectar out, into the mouthparts of the younger bees in the hive. Now the nectar has now passed from the honey sac to the mouths of the younger bees. They now alternate between sucking and blowing the nectar back and forth over the surface of their tongues. Now, as this nectar is constantly moved back and forth over the surface of the tongues, this has a cooling effect and causes evaporation of water from the nectar. So hence the nectar is concentrated. After this process, we get glandular secretions that are secreted, and they combine with the nectar, and this transforms the nectar into the structure, what we know as honey. Then we get more water evaporating, and then the nectar is then transformed into honey. Every now and again, the bees sample this honey to find out and to taste its content if it's right. When the taste is right, this honey now is put into the cell of theirs and sealed with wax. So now the reason why we're going into such lengthy explanation with regard to this process is to show how intricate and how organized the entire process is. And it also gives us an example of the tremendous amount of work that is required to produce this honey. And yet this is done diligently and done constantly. Also, a very important point is highlighted. As I've mentioned, that the nectar which the bee collects does not go it goes into actually the stomach of the bee, but into a separate compartment which is called the honey sac. And that the bee actually regurgitates this nectar out to the other bees when it returns to the hive. Now this is in keeping with the Quranic description of this process, where Allah says in the Quran that the honey issues from within the body of the bee, because we now know that the pollen is actually carried in the leg basket of the bee, but the nectar actually is carried in a sac in the body of the bee. And this nectar, together with glandular secretions, are actually disgorged from the body to the younger bee's mouth parts. So this, as I've said, we've explained the entire process. It highlights the importance of the Quranic description that the bee, the nectar, comes from the stomach of the bee, which was not known before, but now we know that the honey actually comes from the stomach of the bee. Let us now look at another interesting example or interesting phenomena with regard to the cooperation amongst bees and the way in which they cool or maintain the temperature of their hives at a constant level. Now the bees each have got their specific defined function, but they seem to gather their own information about the needs of the hive on their own. What they do is that each bee, when it wants to find out what needs to be done or what work still needs to be done, it wanders around as if it's on a tour of the hive and inspects everything. It looks into the empty cells to see if they have been cleaned. That is the job of the worker bees. It examines the larvae to see if they need to be fed, and if necessary, it goes about doing that. Sometimes some of the bees appear to be idle in the hive, doing nothing, but in actual fact, they are actually acting as reserve troops, ready to be called at an instant notice should there be any threat to the hive. So they are there to defend the nest, if necessary, from any intruders. Or they may have the function to provide air conditioning, that is to maintain the temperature of the hive at a constant level. Now this is quite an intricate process, that is the way in which they maintain the temperature of the hive constant, because it requires cooperation between the bees, and it is quite a complex phenomena. We will very briefly now go into discussing how this temperature is maintained constantly in the hive, specifically so that we can appreciate and understand the marvelous workings in the hive and realize Allah's beneficent and Allah's laws, how He has taught simple creatures the ways in which things need to be done. Let us look at it in the summer months. Now in the hot summer months, the temperature begins to rise. What happens as the temperature starts rising, the temperature in the hive as well starts to rise. So the bees are now responsible to cool this hive. At first what they do is they start fanning their wings. Now this normally is sufficient in dropping the temperature in the hive. But if the temperature in the hive is still warm, then the worker bees bring in water. Now what the worker bees do is very, very marvelous indeed. They cause water to evaporate, and we know when water evaporates, with it, it takes heat in order for it to evaporate, and it leaves behind a cooler surface. So these young workers which get the water in their mouths, they start spreading and rolling the droplets of water on their tongues backwards and forwards, and this causes a release of heat and evaporation of water. This actually brings about a state of cooling, and this coolness spreads to the rest of the hive, and it actually achieves remarkable stability in the temperature of the hive. For example, in full sunlight, where temperatures are at around 70 degrees, the temperature inside the hive can be not more than 30 to 35 degrees. This shows the remarkable balance which the bees can achieve through the process of fanning of the wings and evaporation of water. Now only the old workers collect the water. The young workers are called the sprinklers. Now how do the bees know how much water is needed in order to cool the hive? There is a very simple mechanism which they employ, which tells the old worker bees how much water they need to bring and when they need to stop. What basically happens is it learns whether or not to bring the water in a very, very brief moment when it transfers the water to the young sprinkler bees. When the worker bee brings the water droplet to give it to the young sprinkler bee, the young sprinklers rush up to take the water. It is apparently the enthusiasm which these young sprinkler bees display when they rush to the older worker bees to take up the water. This enthusiasm which they display gives the worker bees an idea as to how much water is needed. If the enthusiasm starts dropping, then the bees which collect the water know that not much water is required. But if the young bees rush up to collect the water from the worker bees, they get an idea that, look, there is an urgency, there is a need for more water. So it's this enthusiasm by which water is transferred from one bee to another, which tells them how much water is in the hive. So this gives us an idea as to the communication patterns amongst the bees. It is something which we don't really know or come across, but it shows us that even in the humble community like the bee, there is order, there is systematic design, and there is definite processes which go on which defy any explanation, except that Allah has instilled in these bees the ability to communicate so accurately and to perform their tasks with such efficiency. Let us look at the opposite scenario. That is in the winter month, when the temperatures outside drop, and how the bees actually maintain the temperatures in the hive at a warmer level. It has been found that throughout winter, the temperatures in the hive never drop below 14 degrees. The bee's behavioral system is so effective that during extreme cold spells, the interior of the hive can be as high as 60 degrees, even though the exterior is much, much lower. Now, how do they go about maintaining warmth in the hive? It is quite an intricate process, but very simply put, is that the bees cluster into a ball around one of the combs. The size of the ball which they clustered depends on the temperature. If it is very cold, the cluster of bees are very dense. The bees inside the cluster make constant muscular movements of their wings, bodies and legs, and this helps in the production of heat. After a period of time, the bees from the center will shift places with those outside, and the bees outside the area of cluster will serve as insulators of heat. So basically, this, as I've said, we've gone into a bit of detail to show how the process of honey is made, to show how they maintain the temperature in the hive constant. This in itself shows that this cannot be by chance. How does the bee know these actions need to be performed? How do they know exactly what mechanisms they need to do in order to maintain the survival of the species? The only explanation is, it is nothing but revelation from Allah Almighty. We will now proceed on to the next aspect of the very marvelous phenomena in which bees actually talk to each other.
The most remarkable is the way bees communicate detailed instructions of direction and of orientation when collecting nectar. This is indeed a very interesting and a very phenomenal occurrence. When a bee locates a source of flowers, it returns to the hive and informs the others exactly of the nature and the position of the source. Now let us see how this incredible communication takes place. If the nectar source is less than 100 yards, the bee on returning is surrounded by the other bees. It disgorges a drop of nectar that it has collected and begins a round dance. Immediately, the other bees fly out and exactly locate the flowers. How do they do this? They do this by first following the scent left by the bee on the flower. We find that each bee has a scent bottle at the end of its body. When it discovers a flower, it deposits its own trademark on the flower, and this scent can be detected by the bees at a considerable distance. Also, when we find, once the bee arrives at the hive, because of the smell of the flowers that is still attached to the bees are able to identify what flower they are looking for. And of course, by the nectar that it disgorges, they are given further information as to what type of flower they are expected to go and find. And so they follow the scent and exactly find the spot where the flowers are. Now, if the nectar source is more than 100 yards, the scout bee must give more detailed instructions. Not only must it tell how far away it is, but it must also show in which direction they must fly. Now, instead of a circle, the scout bee, on returning to the hive, dances a figure of 8 dance. This is a very unique dance. What it does is, it makes a straight run and then makes one semicircle on the right hand side and one semicircle on the opposite side, forming a figure of 8. Now, the speed with which the bee dances and the rate at which it wags its body during the straight path of the figure of 8 dance tells the others exactly how far away the source is. And we find that this communication and this method of dancing and information has been studied extensively and very precisely, and they found that the instructions given by the bee is so exact that when it makes the straight run in forming the figure of 8, in this straight run it indicates how far away the nectar source is by the rapidity with which it beats its wings and by the frequency in which it moves its body. And in this way, this information is interpreted by the bees exactly as giving an estimate of the exact distance. Now, as far as what they must look for, we find that the scent of the flowers adheres to the bee. So when the others gather around the bee, they already smell the flower that they are going to look for, and so they know what the source of the nectar is. Now, how do they know in which direction to fly? This is quite interesting. We find that bees have an amazing sense of orientation. They navigate by the sun. They are able to relate the position of their hive with the direction of polarized light from the sun, and therefore they can steer a beeline course from any compass point. And in this way, a bee is able to find its hive because it knows exactly in which direction in relation to the sun or the light coming from the sun its hive is. And it calculates the exact mathematical angle and is able to fly to the exact point. And in fact, that is why the idiom has come, making a beeline dash, to emphasize the accuracy and the precision with which the bee goes to its particular point. If you look at this dance of the bee, the figure of 8 dance, this is very significant. This dance gives the precise direction in which the bees are to fly in order to find the source of nectar. Now, how does it indicate this direction? Now, the direction is indicated by the straight run that it makes. Now, remember, when it makes the figure of 8 dance, there's a straight run, and on either side is the 2 circles giving you the figure of 8. Now, during the straight run, this is the crucial information. During this straight run, it is made at a precise angle in relation to the sun. Now, the bee orientates the sun as being on top, that is at the top of the hive, and the angle it makes either to the left or to the right informs the others to fly in that direction. Now, this is quite complex and it's difficult to explain, but what it actually means is the bee, the figure of 8, the straight line is made at a particular angle to the vertical, which is the top of the hive. And this angle, for example, if it's 30 degrees to the right of this angle, then it informs the bees that they must fly 30 degrees to the right of the sun. If this angle in relation to the hive is 30 degrees to the left, then it informs the bees they must fly 30 degrees to the left of the sun. And this is indeed an extraordinary feat. For the scout bee has taken an angular measurement in relation to the sun and then communicates it in a linear display in the comb. This is absolutely amazing. What it does is when the bee is actually found the nectar source, it works out the angle, the direction from the hive to the flowers, what angle this makes in relation to the sun. Once it calculates this angle, it is able to demonstrate this angle in the dance. And this is an extraordinary feat in the bee. It is absolutely unbelievable. And we find that all bees in the hive instinctively understand and they know the dance. They are able to interpret exactly how far away the nectar source is, exactly what direction they must fly, and exactly which nectar source they are looking for, and they find it with mathematical precision. Interestingly enough, we find that different species and different geographical races of honeybees all seem to have their own dialect as a manner of speaking. In other words, their dance differs from each other, and each one of them has their own dialect. They understand their own dance. So this is absolutely amazing. Let us refer back to the Quran, which refers to this amazing feat of the honeybee. Surah 16, verses 68 to 69. And thy Lord taught the bee to build her cell in hills, on trees, and in men's habitation, then to eat of all the produce of the earth, and find with skill the spacious parts of its Lord. Now this tells us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given bees this revelation, this guidance to accomplish this, because the Quranic term referred to is Wahi, which is the same term which is referred to revelation given to man through all the prophets, which is Wahi. And this revelation to the bees is in the form of this ingrained instinct and guidance in order to find the precise directions, as Allah says, find with skill the spacious part of Lord. And indeed, it is absolutely remarkable skill displayed by these bees. It has also been discovered that bees use this dance not only to indicate a food source, but also to tell of potential new homes.